So today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to focus entirely on all of the activities over the last decade, but particularly the last couple of years, focused on transforming transplant policy in the United States. And I'm joined by two special guests who are well known to this podcast, Rachel Meyer and Suzanne Watnick. And I thought we would jump right in. Rachel, I'm going to kind of put you on the spot and just ask you to do a high level. If you were talking to someone who was not as familiar with this space and you were to get them excited about all the things that have happened in transplant policy over the last decade, I'm just curious as to how you would tell that story.
So, Todd, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm so excited about everything that's happening in transplantation. In the last decade, I think we've seen a few major milestones on the congressional side. The Immuno Bill, which will be familiar to a lot of listeners, the HOPE Act, and in the last, I would say 24 months or so, a real acceleration really up and down Pennsylvania Avenue. I think what we've seen that has been a major transformation is a shift towards broad agreement across the federal government and within the kidney community that we really need to be working towards breaking down silos between dialysis care and transplant care and focus on the continuum of the patient journey. For our part at ASN, I think the society has really rededicated itself to kidney transplantation as the optimal therapy for most patients. And our advocacy is focused around maximizing access for as many Americans as possible who could benefit, and we're going to talk about this, ensuring that that access is equitable regardless of race, ethnicity, geography, socioeconomic status, et cetera.
So, Rachel, the way you frame that, I'm just sort of curious from Suzanne's perspective, having spent almost the last year in DC working with ASN as a health policy scholar in residence, but also spending a lot of time the Department of Health and Human Services interacting with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. How are you seeing this change in terms of rededication, if you will, to transforming transplant?
Thank you again for teeing up this topic, and it couldn't be more important right now. What I have seen being involved with this over the last couple of decades, but in particular, as you mentioned here on the Hill this year, is that people in Medicare are starting to understand that kidney care is not just about dialysis. And Rachel just mentioned about breaking down silos. That couldn't be more important now. When the ESRD population was first brought in to the care models that were stood up by CMMI under the Affordable Care Act. We saw something that we like to call the ESCA 1.0, the ESRD Seamless Care Organization 1.0, which really just looked at dialysis. But as Medicare started to think about what the optimal value would be to provide care for people with kidney failure and kidney diseases, they broke down those silos and it started to incorporate patients with chronic kidney disease and transplantation. And so you started to see the second version, the ESCO 2.0, with a voluntary model that included bonuses for transplant and incentives for transplant, and a mandatory model where a third of the bonus or the penalty was actually put towards transplantation variables. And now we have the IOTA model that has just been introduced, which is also looking to increase rates of transplant, decrease discards, to do it in equitable fashion. And ASN has specifically provided a lot of commentary, both applauding the attention to the importance of transplantation, but also to make this more feasible and operational, basically making it such that in the future, there are viable pathways to achieve these goals.
So you've kind of taken the discussion into a lot of the opportunities within the rulemaking process. And as David and I have talked about this historically, there are aspects of this where, and I hadn't really thought about it until I was listening to your excellent summary around, we have existing laws that Congress passes, and then they have to be implemented. And the executive branch, in our case, through the Department of Health and Human Services, often the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, proposes rules. The community, including ASN, responds. Then they finalize those rules to implement the laws. Then they have situations like the Medicare ESRD program, where it's an existing codified program, and the role of the executive branch is to sort of tweak it, if you will, on an annual basis. But then, because of the Affordable Care Act, we do have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, where they can try these innovative things. And so they put out an idea, and there's a lot of back and forth, probably more of a role for groups like ASN to comment, because they are trying to get it right, from the get-go. So my sense is this has been sort of the summer of rulemaking in general, but particularly around some transplant issues. So I'm curious, Rachel, as you sort of think about a lot of our responses and a lot of the work that the transplant work group within the Policy and Advocacy Committee and the Quality Committee has been doing, can you just sort of give us a quick summary of some of those activities?
Sure thing. So a few of the major milestones that we're working on bringing to implementation or fruition include HOPE Act implementation, the rollout, which will be a long haul rollout of the Securing the U.S. OPTN Act to really overhaul our transplant system, as well as working with the OPTN to modify, update, and improve existing policy around how transplant centers are graded and what they're doing. We're also working outside of the traditional confines of the federal government, such as pursuing accreditation for transplant nephrology through the ACGME. But before we dive into all of that, I want to just highlight kind of two conflicting realities. They're both true at the same time about transplant policy in general and policy in Washington in particular. Although there is a lot of momentum going on right now that's really exciting, these are all also very multi-year, long-haul efforts that are going to take, years, if not decades, to start to see the full positive effects of. And I think a great place to highlight that the long-haul nature of this work is with the HOPE Act implementation. So back in 2013, ASN and a number of other organizations advocated hard to get Congress to enact legislation that would lift the existing statutory ban on HIV positive to HIV positive transplantations. That bill was passed, and after about a decade of study, the Department of Health and Human Services recently proposed to lift the ban that those transplants be done at a limited number of institutions with a lot of IRB and research rules around them. So this is a really exciting moment where we're seeing, again, more than a decade of ASN advocacy starting to come to a place where every transplant center in the country would have the option to offer patients with HIV the option to get an HIV positive kidney. And that can come with a lot of benefits, such as getting a kidney much faster. I think this is also important not just for the vulnerable, underserved populations that stand to directly benefit from this law that ASN advocated for more than a decade ago. Those with HIV, those who have HIV and ESRD, Black and Hispanic and gay men in particular, who are notoriously underserved by our healthcare system. But this change also helps more people without HIV who are also on the kidney transplant waitlist among the 90,000 plus get transplants faster, because it's growing the total pool of available kidneys that can be used and used safely to help more people get access to what is for many the optimal therapy, a kidney transplant. So that's a good example of the long haul. Maybe we should then shift to talking about some of the things we're working on today in the short term.
I think before we shift to some of the shorter term ones, I'm just curious, Suzanne, from your perspective, I'm kind of curious as to both your reaction to just the sheer amount of time here in each of the steps along the way, and that these are sort of long plays by design, but also as we start to get into some of the shorter examples, what you're most excited about.
Yeah, I love that question, especially thinking about how I sit with people with kidney diseases and kidney failure and talk with them about kidney transplantation. So we know that, in this country, 40% of patients with end-stage kidney disease receiving dialysis will not be alive in 5 years. So when we're talking about the importance of shifting longer-term goals to something that's going to happen more quickly, we see the urgency. We understand why it's so important to get people the optimal therapy if they want that therapy and if they're eligible for it. And like Rachel mentioned, with 90,000 people on the kidney transplant waitlist, we want to make sure that this is done to achieve the optimal number of transplants in an equitable way. So that's how it hits me that we really do need to, one, always work on this to make the connections, make sure we're communicating so that the government and healthcare systems are working together, rowing in the same direction, and making sure that we're expediting, and not placing barriers on placement. Making sure, for example, that discards are not increasing, but rather decreasing. We know that that's been a challenge with some of the changes in this country. I have a feeling that I'm teeing this up for Rachel to comment upon, because really just 5 years ago, discards rates for transplant were about 1 out of 5. And, now that has actually increased to the point where we're almost 1 in 3 transplants are discarded. I'm going to hand that to Rachel just to add some comments.
Yeah, thanks so much, Suzanne. I think you've nicely teed me up to talk about some of the ongoing shifts in our allocation system. So a few years ago, we shifted from kind of a donation service area based system with some hard cutoffs to how patients were assigned points to getting a kidney, to a system that is working towards a more continuous function approach and that allocates kidneys over a greater distance. In 2021, that first step went into place, allocating kidneys over a greater nautical mile area, and there have been some successes with that. But it has also resulted in a lot of operational challenges that transplant programs are contending with. And the data that we're seeing suggests that this approach is deeply inefficient. So this summer, when the OPTN released an update kind of suggesting continuous movement towards this approach to allocation, we at ASN asked some questions about why. In particular, the first few years have really been a challenge. As you noted, 1 in 3 kidneys are currently being discarded. They're not being used, even though data suggests that many patients could actually benefit from them. We also are seeing a tremendous growth in the number of kidneys that are placed out of sequence, that is, given to a patient outside of the order the match run would have suggested. We also see that the system has gotten just slower and less efficient. Today, 99% of organ offers that are made are declined. Last year, while we saw a record number of about 25,000 kidney transplants, that took nearly 30 million offers made to a transplant center. Those all represent offers that a transplant center has to take in, think about, the surgeon has to consider, is this right? Is this wrong? There's just a huge amount of work, and that doesn't represent a system that is efficient or functioning well. What we'd ideally have is an allocation algorithm that has a high degree of likelihood of offering a kidney to a patient whose program is going to accept it on their behalf, and it will be transplanted swiftly and quickly instead of offered and declined by many programs before winding up in the trash can. So as we think about what types of policy changes we might want to see to address these inefficiencies, it really boils down to we need a better organ allocation system that makes more precise predictions of which kidney is going to be a good match for which patient. And in order to do that, we need to have some major improvements to the underlying data and information technology system that this allocation system and our entire system of transplantation operate on top of. The good news is that last year, ASN and other organizations worked with Congress to pass legislation, the Securing the U.S. OPTN Act, that would do just that and really give our U.S. transplant system a big boost towards modernization and shifting towards new ways of doing business to have a system that will hopefully better serve patients and be a more efficient one than we're operating in with all those challenges and many others that I didn't describe today.
It's interesting. You had said that you can hold two things in your head that are at opposite, but both true. And I'm struck that if you look at the last, I'm just going to say 20 years, and how difficult it was to have Congress approve coverage for immunosuppressive drugs, then the HOPE Act, those were both two areas where there was almost unanimous agreement in the community. But it took a long time to get those passed legislatively and then implemented. Now you're talking about something so much more complicated and with clear constituencies that may not all agree, although I think the majority of the groups that ASN interacts with and the majority of the community, particularly the patients, are going to be supportive of these changes. But there's still going to be this difficulty in terms of moving this forward just because it is just a harder issue. At the same time, simultaneously, the pace of change is now there's momentum. And so it's happening more quickly, which is really exciting. And so I guess my question is, I have two questions. One is, do you agree with that sort of overview, which probably could be articulated better? And then my second question to both of you, and Rachel, we'll start with you and then go to Suzanne, is what do you see happening? We do have a change in presidential administration, regardless of who wins the election. We're going to have a change in the House of every member of the House is up for election, a third of the Senate, and you've got the governor's races. There's going to be a lot of governmental change. And how do we sort of both predict what's going to happen next over the next couple of years, but also maintain this momentum, maybe even accelerate it, given the challenges of these issues?
So I think one of the truths that's emerged over the last three presidential administrations is that as a community, we have been successful in lodging kidney and transplant care as a bipartisan, bicameral, cross-presidential administration priority for the United States. And there are a lot of good reasons for that, including because Medicare is the largest primary payer for the care of people with kidney failure. But I think we've also been effective in making the case that there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for improvement that both improves patients' lives and improves the value to the healthcare system of the care that is being covered and delivered primarily by the federal government. It's somewhat of a unicorn in healthcare when the thing that's best can also be the thing that is the most cost efficient. And I think we have just a wealth of opportunities to offer as far as concrete policy ideas to tee whomever is in the White House, whomever is in Congress, and whoever is controlling the regulatory agencies up for success if they choose to take and run with those ideas we have to offer them.
Rachel, I really like how you teed that up because it was what I was thinking too, that there are a lot of bipartisan, bicameral agreements that this is the right direction to go. If you think about it, back in 1972, when legislation was passed, to support patients on maintenance dialysis, no matter what age they were. People sometimes forget that that legislation included kidney transplantation as well. And, it was 14 years later that a contractor was awarded the full scope of care to be providing, oversight and assistance to make sure that people had access to kidney transplantation. 1984 is, the year this was passed in 1986 when they actually awarded that contract. So I graduated high school in 1986. Sorry for dating myself, but that feels like a very, very long time ago. So the good thing is, again, with some of the legislation, which, as you mentioned, is bipartisan and bicameral, we're trying to update and overhaul, certainly not discarding any of the great work that has been done by so many people, by so many systems over time. But we do need to recognize all of the updates we've had in things like technology, IT infrastructure, ability to support. And not everybody has expertise in every area, but why not bring in different players to make sure that we're supporting the various portions of the transplant allocation group. So I know that ASN has been working closely with HRSA to help oversee the OPTN contracts, and they were just recently awarded. Rachel knows all of the details of all of this, but the bottom line is that the government is really trying to help move this forward despite the expedited issues that have come up over the last really 1 to 2 years, to do this in a thoughtful, measured way, talking with the community. And I know that we've been playing a role with those groups to ensure that things are going to be smooth and done in a reasonable way to update the system and get access to care to more people with kidney diseases.
So, Rachel, do you want to respond really quickly in terms of some of those updates? I do want to close with, you had mentioned the ACGME, so I do want to close there, but I think it's clear we need to respond to Suzanne's comments. But also, I'm thinking about 1984, and the number one song, it's 40 years ago. The number one song was Prince's When Doves Cry. The number one movie was Beverly Hills Cop. And of course, there was a sequel this year that came out on Netflix. And then the number one TV show was either Dallas or Dynasty. I can't remember which, but I've just really dated myself. So Rachel, help me out here.
Well, 1984 had its hits. 2024 has its own set of hits. Time will tell how they hold up and endure. But I think to respond to Suzanne's observations, I'm going to come back to the maxim of multiple things are true at once, which is our transplant system is the largest in the world. It's served thousands, if not millions of patients well over the last 40 years. And it can also do better for many patients that is not serving well today. And I think what she just articulated in terms of the changes we're working with HRSA and Congress to implement, hopefully 40 years from now, we'll point to many more successes than we can, celebrate today. And I'm optimistic that what we're working on with ACGME, though outside the traditional confines of the federal government, will also help shift the subspecialty of transplant nephrology in an elevated and positive direction.
Yeah, and I think that's where we should close. So usually on this podcast, we focus on federal legislative and federal regulatory policy. Occasionally, when we've talked about the sort of decisions around, say, Chevron, we'll get into some aspects of the judicial branch, but it's really federal legislative and regulatory policy. But what's unique about healthcare, and particularly about the role of physicians in U.S. healthcare, is that is a self-governing profession, and there's a lot of profession-sanctioned entities. And so physicians are responsible for the accreditation of medical schools, the accreditation of residency and fellowship training programs, the certification and recertification of physicians, et cetera. So as you look across that whole continuum of both educational institutions and then the overall sort of certification or assessment of physicians, those are all activities that physicians have direct responsibility for, which is unique in U.S. sort of, if you think of the economy, that's a unique opportunity. Rachel, since you were directly involved in working with the American Society of Transplantation on this project, I'll let you tee it up. Suzanne is a recovering nephrology fellowship training program director, so I know she has thought a lot about this issue as well. That's my background, so this is something I get excited about too. But I do think this is a nice place to stop or to end.
Yeah, thanks. So earlier this year, ASN and AST jointly submitted an application to ACGME requesting that we receive accreditation for transplant nephrology as a unique subspecialty of general nephrology, really reflecting the incredible scientific advancements in transplant nephrology as a field, the unique year of dedicated training that those who specialize in this arena already undergo, and with the goal of further standardizing and ensuring a uniform level of rigor for the training that's provided to everyone who wants to enter transplant nephrology as a profession across the country. We are at this moment in time awaiting the final word from ACGME as to whether that application will be approved. And if approved, this will unlock a couple years of transition to bring transplant nephrology programs into the formal ACGME fold, shifting away from the AST accreditation processes of the past. But what's really exciting from my perspective is that this accreditation will also unlock a host of other opportunities for transplant nephrology as a subspecialty that are currently not accessible to it without this ACGME accreditation. I'll give you a great example. We all know that transplant nephrologists struggle to maintain a similar RVU generation pace as do general nephrologists and those providing dialysis. With ACGME accreditation, ASN, AST, RPA, other organizations, ASN, AST, other organizations dedicated to ensuring that all of nephrology is appropriately reimbursed can pursue dedicated transplant nephrology RVUs at the level of the AMA, opening up a new world of hopefully reimbursement that aligns more with the value of care that's provided to patients. I'll give you another great example. Today, Medicare can't determine who's a general nephrologist and who's a transplant nephrologist. And as you think about our ongoing shift into a value-based care world where you're really trying to understand what is the value that each participant in the system is providing to patients, it's pretty important to be able to distinguish which type of provider you are. Again, ACGME accreditation would unlock the possibility of our working with Medicare to identify who is and who isn't a transplant nephrologist and allow them to be better remunerated and rewarded for the excellent care that they're providing to patients.
Rachel, thank you very much for really detailing all of those issues that confront us as nephrologists, sometimes every day. You know, as nephrologists, I really do think that we work incredibly hard. We're so dedicated to our patients, and we really want to do the best we can for them. And with all of that, we want to demonstrate our value. And how better to demonstrate our value than to be able to say, you are certified to do this. You have value in such that we should be remunerating you for the work that you're doing. And I really do think that being able to acknowledge the additional knowledge that the transplant nephrologists have with an ACGME certification would be beneficial. So I really appreciate that shout out for the examples, both from an RVU perspective, because we do need to show the work that we're doing, but also from being able to be designated in various care models or healthcare systems that we are providing value to that patient, to that system in a specialized way. So thank you for doing that.
So I think that's a good place to close. I know we've covered a lot, and we've moved between the legislative branch and the regulatory branch, but then we've also drifted into the profession sanctioned aspects with the ACGME. And well, thanks Suzanne and Rachel and Lauren. As always, thanks for producing. Hopefully the pop culture references to 1984 weren't too traumatizing for you or for other members of our audience. And I look forward to continuing the discussion in the future.
This podcast is copyrighted by the American Society of Nephrology. All rights reserved. All content in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended to be medical advice. This podcast should not be used in a medical emergency or for the diagnosis or treatment of any medical condition. Please consult your doctor or other qualified healthcare professional if you have any questions about any medical condition or before taking any drug, changing your diet, or commencing or discontinuing any course of treatment. Thank you for listening to this podcast from the American Society of Nephrology.